There was a friar, a wanton one, and merry, a limiter, a very festive fellow. In all four orders there was none so mellow, so glib, and with gallant phrase, and well-turned speech. He'd fixed up many a marriage, giving each of his young women what he could afford her. He was a noble pillar to his order, highly beloved, and intimate was he with country folk within his boundary, and city dames of honour and possessions, for he was qualified to hear confessions, or so he said, with more than priestly scope. He had a special license from the Pope. Sweetly he heard his penitents at shrift, with pleasant absolution for a gift. He was an easy man in penance-giving, where he could hope to make a decent living. It's a sure sign, whenever gifts are given to a poor order, that a man's well shriven, and should he give enough, he knew, in verity, the penitent repented in sincerity. For many a fellow is so hard of heart, he cannot weep for all his inward smart. Therefore, instead of weeping and of prayer, one should give silver for a poor friar's care. He kept his tippet stuffed with pins for curls, and pocket-knives to give to pretty girls. And certainly his voice was gay and sturdy, for he sang well and played the hurdy-gurdy. At sing-songs he was champion of the hour. His neck was whiter than a lily-flower, but strong enough to butt a bruiser down. He knew the taverns well in every town, and every innkeeper and barmaid too, better than lepers, beggars, and that crew. For in so eminent a man as he, it was not fitting with the dignity of his position, dealing with a scum of wretched lepers, nothing good can come. Of dealing with the slum and gutter dwellers, but only with the rich and victual sellers. But anywhere a profit might accrue. Courteous he was, and lowly of service too. Natural gifts like his were hard to match. He was the finest beggar of his batch, and for his begging district paid a rent. His brethren did no poaching where he went, for though a widow mightn't have a shoe, so pleasant was his holy how-do-you-do, he got his farthing from her just the same before he left, and so his income came to more than he laid out. And how he romped, just like a puppy! He was ever prompt to arbitrate disputes on settling days, for a small fee in many helpful ways, not then appearing as your cloistered scholar, with threadbare habit hardly worth $1, but much more like a doctor or a pope. Of double worsted was the semi-cope upon his shoulders, and the swelling fold about him like a bell about its mould, when in its casting rounded out his dress. He lisped a little out of wantonness, to make his English sweet upon his tongue. When he had played his harp, or having sung, his eyes would twinkle in his head as bright as any star upon a frosty night. This worthy's name was Hubert, it appeared. There was a merchant, with a forking beard, and motley dress. High on his horse he sat, upon his head a Flemish beaver hat, and on his feet daintily buckled boots. He told of his opinions and pursuits in solemn tones, and how he never lost the sea should be kept free at any cost. He thought upon the Harwich Holland range. He was expert at currency exchange. This estimable merchant so had set his wits to work, none knew he was in debt. He was so stately in negotiation, loan, bargain, and commercial obligation. He was an excellent fellow all the same. To tell the truth, I do not know his name. An Oxford cleric, still a student though, who had taken logic long ago, was there. His horse was thinner than a rake, for he was not too fat, I undertake, but had a hollow look, a sober stare. The thread upon his overcoat was bare. He had found no preferment in the church, and he was too unworldly to make search for secular employment. By his bed he preferred having 20 books in red and black of Aristotle's philosophy to having fine clothes, fiddle, or solitary. Though a philosopher, as I have told, he had not found the stone for making gold. Whatever money from his friends he took, he spent on learning or another book, and prayed for them most earnestly, returning Thanks to them, thus, for paying for his learning. His only care was study, and indeed he never spoke a word more than was need. Formal at that, respectful in the extreme, short, to the point, and lofty in his theme, the thought of moral virtue filled his speech, and he would gladly learn and gladly teach. A sergeant of the law, who paid his calls, wary and wise, for clients at St. Paul's, there also was, of noted excellence. Discreet he was, a man of reverence, or so he seemed. His sayings were so wise, he often had been justice of assize. By letters patent and in full commission, his fame and learning and his high position had won him many a robe and many a fee. There was no such a conveyancer as he. All was fee simple to his strong digestion. Not one conveyance could be called in question. Nowhere there was so busy a man as he, but was less busy than he seemed to be. He knew every judgment, case, and crime recorded ever since King William's time. He could dictate defenses or draft deeds. No one could pinch a comma from his screeds. And he knew every statute off by rote. He wore a homely, parti-colored coat, grit with a silken belt of pinstripe stuff. Of his appearance I have said enough. There was a Franklin with him, it appeared. White as a daisy petal was his beard, a sanguine man, high-colored and benign. He loved a morning sop of cake in wine. He lived for pleasure and had always done, for he was Epicurus' very son, in whose opinion sensual delight was the one true felicity in sight. As noted as St. Julian was for bounty, he made his household free to all the county. His bread, his ale, were finest of the fine, and no one had a better stock of wine. His house was never short of bake-meat pies, of fish, of flesh, and those in such supplies that positively snowed with meat and drink, and all the dainties that a man could think according to the seasons of the year. Changes of dish were ordered to appear. He kept fat partridges in coops beyond. Many a bream and pike were in his pond. Woe to the cook whose sauces had no sting, or who was unprepared in anything. And in his hall a table stood arrayed, and ready all day long with places laid. As justice at the sessions none stood higher. He often had been member for the shire. A dagger and a little purse of silk hung at his girdle, white as morning milk. As sheriff he checked, audit every entry. He was a model among landed gentry. A haberdasher, a dyer, a carpenter, a weaver, and a carpet-maker were among our ranks, all in the livery of one impressive guild fraternity. They were so trim and fresh their gear would pass for new. Their knives were not tricked out with brass, but wrought with purest silver, which avouches, like a display on girdles and on pouches. Each seemed a worthy burgess fit to grace a guild hall with a seat upon their dais. Their wisdom would have justified a plan to make each one of them an alderman. They had the capital and revenue. Beside their wives declared it was their due. And if they did not think so, then they ought. To be called madam is a glorious thought, and so is going to church and being seen, having your mantle carried like a queen. They had a cook with them, who stood alone for boiling chicken with a marrow bone, sharp flavoring powder, and a spice for savor. He could distinguish London ale by flavor. And he could roast and seethe and broil and fry, and make good thick soup, and bake a tasty pie. What a pity, so it seemed to me, that he should have an ulcer on his knee. As for blanche-mange, he made it with the best. There was a skipper, hailing from far west. He came from Dartmouth, so I understand. He rode a farmer's horse as best he could, in a wooden gown that reached to his knee. A dagger, on a lanyard falling free, hung from his neck under his arm and down. The summer heat had tanned his color brown, and certainly he was an excellent fellow. Many a draught of vintage red and yellow he'd drawn at Bordeaux, while the traitor snored. The nicer rules of conscience he ignored. If, when he fought, the enemy vessel sank, he sent his prisoners home, they walked the plank. As for his skill in reckoning tides, currents, and many other risks besides, moons, harbors, pilots, he had such dispatch that none from Hull to Carthage was his match. Hardly he was prudent in undertaking, his beard in many a tempest had its shaking, and he knew all the heavens as they were, from Gotland to the Cape of Finisterre, and every creek in Brittany and Spain. The barge he owned was called the Madeleine. A doctor, too, emerged as we proceeded. No one alive could talk as well as he did, on points of medicine and of surgery, for being grounded in astronomy. He watched his patient's favourable star, and, by his natural magic, knew what are the lucky hours and planetary degrees for making charms and magic effigies. The cause of every malady you'd got he knew, and whether dry, cold, moist, or hot. He knew their seat, their humour, and condition. He was a perfect practising physician. These causes being known for what they were, he gave the man his medicine then and there. All his apothecaries in a tribe were ready with the drugs he would prescribe, and each made money from the other's guile. They had been friendly for a goodish while. He was well versed in Asclepius too, and what Hippocrates and Rufus knew, and Dioscorus, now dead and gone, Galen, and Rhasis, Halley, Serapion, Averroes, Avicenna, Constantine, Scotch Bernard, John of Gaddesden, Gilbertine. In his own diet he observed some measure. There was no superfluities for pleasure, only digestives, nutritives, and such. He did not read the Bible very much. In blood-red garments slashed with bluish grey and lined with taffeta he rode his way. Yet he was rather close as to expense, and kept the gold he won in pestilence. Gold stimulates the heart, or so we're told. He therefore had a very special love of gold. We'll stop there.